Welcome everybody. We're here today at Bear Creek Distillery. We're going to get a tour of their facility. Come check it out. I have Ryan Stoltzfus here. He's going to guide us through a tour of their awesome distillery here. Ryan?
Heck yeah, thanks for coming by. I appreciate that a lot. Yeah, my name's Ryan. I'm a tour guide here, been here about 6 years now. I love what we do. And so just kind of want to show you all around a little bit and fill you in on a bit of our process. Not everything, you got to come down and talk to me if you want it all. Just gonna plug that. So starting with here, I mean, this is where it all starts, right? This is our big, beautiful still. This is a Kota still. Kota is just a German manufacturer. We kind of went that route as opposed to like a Vendome, for example. Mostly because our head distiller, Jeff, he went and got a little bit of training at Blonde Brothers out in Illinois, and they have the same still. So it was kind of like a try before you buy sort of situation, and that's why we went that direction with Kota. We call it a pot column hybrid still. It's just hybrid in that we've kind of taken a couple different ideas from the distilling world and mashed them together. So we have our pot still, old world style distillation, been around for always and forever.
The Irish are big fans of pot distilling, correct?
Absolutely.
Yep.
Irish and Scotch whiskey relies on it heavily as well. And then you have your columns, which are a much more modern, kind of efficient, consistent form of distillation.
And your Kentucky guys are big in the
Absolutely, yeah, for sure. If you're ever in Kentucky, it's fun to see those columns that are like stories tall. They're huge. It's pretty cool. So again, by combining these things, we're essentially allowed to make all those different products that we have between whiskey, vodka, and rum. So I'll touch on that a little bit more later, but we love this system. The building was built around it essentially. Like you can kind of see at the top that black water hose. Like it couldn't go above that, and so typically these columns are actually a little bit taller and more narrow, but they had to make them a little bit shorter and wider just to fit into the room. We just have the custom hand hammer jackets around all of our equipment. You can see this beautiful design continuity throughout, which is really great. Just great German engineering, we love it.
So Ryan, tell us where we're at right now.
Yeah, so this is gonna be our mash tank. This is where we're gonna start our process. It's essentially just a glorified pot, you know. So got a steam jacket wrapped around the outside. That's gonna be our heat source. You know, heat is a very important component of a couple different steps here. We're obviously coming from fire in our history. You can still find a couple distilleries around that are using direct fired equipment, which is kind of cool, kind of crazy to me. Essentially all we're gonna do with this, fill it up halfway with water, and then you can load in, you know, 700 to 1,000 pounds of grain or sugar, kind of depending on what we're making for the day.
Right there. And you being the grain guy, what specifically do you guys look for in grain, and why is it important here?
I'll define a couple of things there a little bit. First of all, you know, we do have whiskey, which is what we focus on a lot, and by law that has to be made from grain.
Right.
And so whiskey is that umbrella term. Everything's a type of whiskey. So bourbon's whiskey, Scotch is whiskey. And what sets it apart is that type of grain.
Right.
And we really rely on those flavors that are coming out of the individual grain. It's kind of easy to think of a grain as just a singular thing. Like, I feel like sometimes we throw around even like wheat and grain is kind of the same thing. But they are very different. It is a crop, and there are many different varieties. Just think about, you know, tomatoes, for example.
Right.
Like there's so many different like shapes, sizes, colors, flavors of tomatoes, but it's all tomato.
Right.
Same with, you know, wheat, same with rye, same with corn. Like there's all these different varieties that you can kind of play around with to find these different flavors.
Right.
But focusing more on kind of as a whole what they are, you know, corn is incredibly important if we're making bourbon, because as everyone probably knows, it's got to be at least 51% corn.
Right.
So the majority grain in that recipe or mash bill. And corn is sweet. Like that is the backbone of bourbon. We want that sweetness,
right.
And we want it to just be a nice, easy drinking product. And so corn kind of helps us get there. So for us, we're going to start with 75% yellow corn that we get from the Whiskey Sisters out in Burlington, Colorado. And then we're going to kind of follow that up with 15% dark northern organic rye that we get from Heartland Mills out in Kansas.
Okay.
Flavor wise, because it's all about flavor, rye is everything corn is not. It's very heavy, it's earthy, spicy.
Yep.
It balances out the sweetness of the corn essentially. Right. And then we're going to finish it off with 10% malted barley that we're getting from Breeze Malting. In American whiskey, that's changing, but a lot of times we're not relying on malt as much for flavor. You know, it's just, there's some enzymes that we create in that grain that are going to help the yeast to do its job.
Right.
So obviously that is starting to change as we're seeing more American single malt. When you see that term single malt, it just means it's made out of 100% malted barley. Then we're just tasting that grain, which is really cool.
Right.
So 75, 15, 10, that's going to be the Bear Creek straight bourbon. And I can guarantee you there's another distillery with that same mash bill or recipe, but then you get to talk about, you know, what's your water source, where are those grains grown,
well, and depending on the varietals of grain that they're using, right? It's all going to change the flavor, right?
Yeah.
So
I mean, if your distiller is left-handed or right-handed, you know, it's a huge difference in flavor. And I actually love that, right? There's so many variables that create change in flavor.
Right.
So regardless of what we're making, you know, everything's going to get loaded in here. Whiskey's a grain-based distillate. You know, rum has to be made from some form of sugar. We're using an evaporated cane juice, which is essentially a raw sugar.
Right.
Organic sugar we're getting from Brazil. And then vodka, there's no regulation around ingredients, so you can throw the kitchen sink at it, you know, and distill
just
it to
high
death
proof,
and
flavorless, right? That's supposed to,
absolutely. And that's why you will see, like, obviously potato vodka, grain vodka, there's beet sugar vodka, there's hemp vodka, I saw buffalo grass vodka. There's just,
you guys have,
and we have grain vodka.
And you guys, and specifically you got a rye vodka, which is a little bit unusual, right?
Yeah, for sure. And it's, we do one single grain in all of our vodka, so 100% corn, wheat, and rye. Because it's important for us to have that grain flavor stand out, even in a vodka setting. As we just said, you have to distill it a lot, but the soul of that grain is absolutely still there.
Right.
And so that's a really cool thing to
Very
experience.
cool.
All we're gonna do is let that grain in water sit and cook. Very simple process. We're just trying to get at the starch. As you cook it, that starch starts to break down into maltose, which is the type of sugar. Kind of breakdown occurs with those enzymes we find in the malted barley, amylase and cytase, which will be on the test. Just kidding, but you better.
Great, I get tested tonight. Something fierce, so here we go.
Right. So yeah, that's all we're doing, because then as we are creating that sugar source, we have that sweet sugary liquid. If you're familiar with beer brewing, like, this is the same thing. You know, you're cooking some grain and water, you create a wort, and then you can add in yeast, which is a living thing. It needs food to survive, so it's going to eat through that yeast source. And as that happens, we produce heat, CO2, and alcohol, essentially.
Right.
So, simple step, but you got to do it, because that's where your booze comes from, right? At the end of the day.
And we're headed there next, right?
Absolutely.
All right.
So we're on to the next step of fermentation, which is essentially we're just taking that grain and water and yeast mixture and moving everything over to our fermenters, and we're just going to allow that yeast to sit and do work. So we're producing more alcohol, and we're starting to develop a lot of flavor, because fermentation kind of is that, it is flavor.
Right.
And I'm a big believer in this piece, really starting to set you apart as a distillery, is, you know, what type of yeast strain you're using, because different yeast will produce some different flavors for sure. And then we kind of use the tools of time and temperature to kind of separate ourselves a little bit as well. So how long do you let it sit, and at what temperature, essentially. So for us, you know, we're going to let that sit for about 6 days at 80 degrees. We're regulating this with these two bands here. It's the glycol chilling system. There's a lot of energy in there when the yeast is active, so it warms up on its own naturally. So once it hits 80 degrees, chilling system kicks on, kind of holds it at that point.
So heat is generated completely from the yeast doing their thing.
Yep, absolutely.
Very cool.
Yeah, for sure. How we look at this is the less you ferment something, kind of the lighter, cleaner, sweeter, maybe a bit more grain forward that product will be, because you're adding on less fermentation flavor.
Right.
And so if you ferment it less, you should have less of those flavors, and you should get more of the original ones that are coming from your ingredients, versus the longer you ferment something, kind of the heavier, more robust, and rich that spirit might be.
Right.
One is not better than the other. You kind of just get to pick and choose, you know, what you want to highlight.
Well, in whiskey, I mean, there's so many, as we talked about earlier, so many different types and blends and, you know, whatever. It's kind of to whatever distillers' tastes and stuff that they want, right?
Absolutely.
So,
Yeah. So it's fun to be able to trust Jeff with those things, and like trust his process. And he's good at what he does at the end of the day. So
got to meet Jeff some point.
Yes. Yeah, he's a good guy. He loves talking to people. It's good.
You got to add that laugh in there.
So essentially at the end of that 6 days, we got about 8 to 10% ABV beer. We do call it a distiller's beer or a wash. And it is a beer, right? Like again, same process as a brewery, thereabouts. Sorry if I'm offending any brewer, but it is somewhat similar. But then at this point, we get to take it one step further, spend a lot more money on equipment, and become a distillery, which is great. So go look at that.
All right.
Welcome to Hot Donna. Here she is. Again, we have a steam jacket wrapped around the outside for a heat source. We're using copper as a metal, which you'll probably see it essentially any distillery you go to. It's a really great conductor of heat, right? So it's gonna just move heat around very efficiently, keep everything nice and evenly hot. It's also gonna help to kind of purify our spirit a little bit because we will produce sulfur on some level during fermentation, and we're trying to remove that essentially because we don't want a sulfury sort of spirit.
Right.
And so as that sulfur is interacting with our copper, it kind of starts to break down into copper sulfate. And then what happens is copper sulfate as a material is not volatile, so it's not turning to steam. And the only thing that's getting through this whole process is going to be steam that comes back into a liquid. So we are kind of drawing that out just by using copper as a metal. And that's why you're going to see it at a lot of spots for sure. So again, distiller's beer goes in. We're gonna warm up that liquid to just below the boiling point of water because alcohol evaporates at a slightly cooler temperature. So essentially, as it evaporates, moves up to the top of the pot and gets pushed through this horizontal pipe. But then at this junction, we do have it positioned to where that vapor can only move down into the bottom of our first column here.
Okay.
So essentially, we do have the ability to just do a pot distillation, which I think is really cool.
Yeah.
We haven't done that yet, but as the squeaky wheel of the company, maybe someday I'll get through it.
Well, Jay informed me that he'll never turn down any ideas, right?
Right,
So
exactly.
Yeah, that's
very
good.
open. As not being invested, as I'm not invested, I don't worry about the money. You know,
Right.
it's fine. Just the money. No, but I do like the customization kind of this setup. We have these different kind of pieces that we're looking at here. You see with each individual window. What we can do with this is kind of open or close an additional port in each one. So these little black knobs on the side, that's kind of what we're doing with that. And all that really comes down to is a measure of time. So the more we have closed off, the longer it's gonna take versus the less we have closed off, the less time it will take. And that's when we get to talk about our different spirits. So like vodka is a very clean spirit. It's not meant to have a lot of flavor or aroma. It just needs to be very neutral. To accomplish that, you just have to distill it a lot. And that's why you'll see, bottles with labels that say it's distilled a billion times, whatever it is. So essentially what's gonna happen is we're gonna close off all 16 of these sections in both of our columns. So we're kind of turning each piece into a little pot still almost. What happens is, again, if we're making vodka, we're going to be entering into this chamber. It will be forced to hold here for a bit. You'll see the vapor condensing a little. It's very active. It's jumping around because there's a lot of pressure in here as well. Eventually it'll get pushed into this next piece, and then that'll happen again. It'll condense, and then eventually it'll evaporate, and then condense, evaporate, all the way up, over, down, and repeat over here. So it's all about that kind of like recycling or reflux, and that just means it's taking a lot of time. And so what we're gonna do is once we get through both columns and all those sections, we'll actually take that raw alcohol and load it back in and do that 2 more times.
Okay.
And so that's about a 2-day process to make vodka. And by the time we're done, we're looking at about 190 proof for that spirit.
Okay.
And by law, vodka has to be 190 proof or higher to even be called that. So legally, you can't really distill something less to have a little bit more flavor and call it vodka. That's just not what it is.
Right.
But that's where bourbon comes in. It is a flavorful spirit. And we essentially are going to hold on to those flavors that were already in there, and we just remove them for vodka. And to do that, you distill it less.
Right.
And so we're just gonna close off these first 3 sections here in one column. And that's just gonna take us about 8 hours. So again, with our bourbon, just 3 of these pieces, or 150 proof coming off the still. Legally, bourbon can't be over 160 because we are trying to hold on to those flavors that are coming from the grain, that are coming from fermentation,
right?
That are present for everything. We have a rye whiskey and a rye vodka, so they start the same way. We cook it the same way, we ferment it the same way with the exact same yeast. it's literally the same distiller's beer that goes into Donna, but then you just decide, let's make vodka today, cool. Close off all your sections, take a lot of time, call it vodka, or just kidding, it's gonna be whiskey today. Just close off a few of these in one, and now it's whiskey. So that amount of distillation really dictates what your product is. Once you get through all the copper, you hit this silver column at the end. This is our condenser. It's kind of a cold water jacket wrapped around the outside of the pipes running through the middle. So any vapor that gets close to it will condense back into a liquid, start to flow out of our spout here. So we'll just roll a big tank underneath and start to collect. And this is where we kind of get to talk about those three sort of theoretical pieces that we all know and love, the heads, hearts, and tails. Essentially, it's, again, theoretical. And this is where the head distiller gets to kind of pick and choose when these pieces exist.
There is a safety component there, right? Because some of those things coming off of that can poison you, right?
Absolutely.
So there's some of that stuff needs, but then from beyond that point, it's kind of the creativity to the distiller, correct?
For sure. The first liquid that starts to flow off is what we call the heads. It's very high proof. It is essentially rubbing alcohol of sorts, because there's many different types of alcohol, right? And not all of them are safe to consume. And so the tools that we're using, we have a hydrometer in our case here. It's measuring proof. So we're looking for specific proof points. Volumetrically, we know we're going to get about 12 gallons, and that should be consistent because we have really strict times and temperatures and recipes on the back end. So you hit all your variables, you should get a similar output. Jeff is definitely using his senses because the head is smelling like acetone or dry erase marker. It smells like you shouldn't drink it, essentially.
Right.
But then once you get into the hearts, the middle piece, that goes away completely smell-wise. It becomes very clean, lightly sweet. And that's when we know, cool, this is going to be a really good base spirit for us. We're going to get about 40 gallons of hearts per distillation. And then as it continues to flow, we get into the tails. It's the lowest proof. Aroma kind of comes back. We get more of the fermented, kind of fruity, floral sort of notes coming back. And we're going to keep about 3 to 5 gallons of our tails, blend that in with the hearts, and that's kind of our finished bulk spirit. For most of our whiskeys, we're just doing one run. Stripping run and spirit run, very common practices. We actually do that with our wheat whiskey only, which I think is kind of cool. The wheat whiskey, we really leaned heavily on Dave Pickerel, who's a legend in the industry. He worked at Makers, I believe, for many, many years, and then opened a consulting business and helped a lot of distilleries open. And I'm really proud to say that he helped us with that. He passed away a few years ago, and that was his thing, is like double distill your wheat whiskey specifically.
Interesting.
Because I've asked Jeff about that, like, why do we do it just for this one? He's like, Dave said to do it. So we're just going to do it.
A legend told me to do it, so we're going to leave it right there.
That kind of checks out.
Yeah.
So yeah, now that we have that raw spirit, about 40 to 50 gallons, depending on the day, we're ready for the next step. We do bottle and label everything here. This is our huge bottling area in this corner, which is great. And you can fill 4 bottles at a time, put all the corks in by hand. Got a little heat gun to put the shrink wrap around each bottleneck. We have a labeler, labels 1 bottle at a time. Which is pretty cool.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it works most of the time.
Most of the time. Did you ever get a crooked label? That's when it wasn't.
Right.
Yeah.
All right, so this is going to be our barrel storage facility. This is where everything is for us right now. Looking at about 320 barrels in here. This has always been the spot. It's been the only spot, and we're really proud to say that we do every step of that process, from distilling, aging, bottling. But yeah, this is kind of the end of the road for our whiskeys. Kind of what we're doing with barrels and aging, very old technology, but essentially what we got to do is use a new charred oak container. So it's got to be new. We're only using these once. It's got to be charred or burned on the inside. It's got to be made out of some type of oak. I always like to make sure people know what it looks like. This is what the inside of the barrel is looking like. So we have that nice sort of carbon or charcoal layer from the burning. And it's not done here, it's done at our Cooper, the barrel mill.
What does the char help our audience understand what the char means to the finished spirit?
Yeah, so a couple different functions. One, again, we've turned that wood into carbon or charcoal, so it's a nice natural filter within the wood. And then one of the reasons we're required to use oak is it contains a really high concentration of like 4 different types of sugars, essentially. All that really means is if we are burning the wood, we are burning those sugars as well. And burnt sugar is essentially caramel, right? And so anything coming off our still is going to be clear, but whiskey has that nice sort of caramely color and flavor, and that's just because we've burned the sugars in the wood and therefore caramelized them. So that's why we have to do that, and why we talk about aging and why things take time, because it does take time to break down those sugars to take on the desired color and flavor. Color comes very fast. In the first year, you're going to see a lot of that color happening, but flavor takes a little bit longer.
Now, the level of char plays a role in the color too, correct?
It does, yeah, and flavor as well.
Okay.
Because essentially, like the more you char something, kind of the heavier and deeper it's going to get, because it's kind of relying on my baking background here a little bit. Like the deeper you take that color of caramel, like you're getting close to burning it, but you want to kind of find that sweet spot where it gets very heavy and rich. And so it kind of depends on what flavors you're trying to get out of the barrel. There's plenty of conversation around like smaller barrels do better with this char versus a bigger barrel does better with this char level. Then you can talk about toasting and all of these things. It's a fascinating science that's just wood. And I love that.
It's so simple.
We spend so much time and energy and thought just looking at oak. And it's
it's been a product that's been around for a long time. We've been playing around with it a long time, right? So but it's amazing how simple it really is.
Absolutely. So, and we're not climate controlling our space to kind of help with that process along. So it gets nice and hot in here in the summer. So the oak fibers are going to open up.
Yeah, fibers open up, right? Let the product expand a little bit.
Yeah, alcohol expands.
Cold's going to squeeze it back out, right?
Yeah, exactly. We just like to kind of think the barrel's breathing a little bit, right? And so that's where we also get to celebrate climate. You know, it's everywhere in the world is going to have a little bit of a different climate, depending on like how much temperature fluctuation you have and how dry or humid it is. And so out here, it is super dry, and we get really, really big temperature swings 12 months out of the year, right? And so we are making a name for ourselves in a few different ways, but our climate is one of those, because we get a lot of interesting interaction with the wood. As we were saying earlier, it doesn't age faster. It absolutely ages differently though, because, you know, it's, dry, big fluctuations versus like Kentucky, which is very humid, and it gets super hot and super cold, but there are seasons, and I miss those sometimes. There are rules, so you just get very different climates.
I mean, even taking it over to Scotland, right, where it's a lot more temperate, right? It's going to be temperate. You got a much narrower band in terms of temperatures and humidity and all that stuff, right? And depending where they're at in Scotland, but it's really cool to know that we're developing our own brand of spirit here, just based in part of our climate, right? We got mountains, snow. You know, summers do get warm, especially here in Denver, but we're mile high, so altitude plays a role in that too, right? So it's really cool to hear that you guys are taking advantage of that. So
yeah, for sure, and it's cool to see, and I think that, you know, kind of on the negative, we are experiencing more evaporative loss, the angel share, because like these are liquid type and they're not airtight. That kind of helps to develop our spirit a bit, but you know, we do lose a little bit more because of that. We have seen up to 10% loss in these smaller barrels before. A little bit less in the bigger ones, but up to 7% loss. Not all the time, but it can be up to that.
That's partly why you're never going to see like a 12 or 15 year spirit come out.
And that was going to be my point. I think if we want to see that, we will have to look at humidifying our space. And in Colorado, we're starting to see some folks experiment with that, because I don't think you'd ever see anything much past 15 years without that. Understanding our climate, understanding what barrel size is doing. Because essentially, like, we have 30-gallon barrels on this side, 53-gallon barrels on this side and behind us. 30-gallon barrels are holding rye whiskey, wheat whiskey, and wheated bourbon. And we like this size barrel because we are developing a spirit in a little bit of a different way. And that comes down to surface area, right? There's less liquid in the barrel to more surface area of oak. So it's kind of like there's more love to go around for the liquid that's in there. And so it does develop in a little bit of a different way. And so once we hit about 2 to 2.5 years, we're really liking what's coming out of these barrels. And that's in contrast to your 53s, where it's the opposite. Of more liquid to less surface area means a little bit more time. And so for us, that's always going to be a minimum of 4 years before we crack into one of these barrels. So in 53s, it's mostly our straight bourbon. Got a lot of rum projects and also some rye whiskey and wheated bourbon floating around as well. Barrel size allows us to play with different flavors, because I would never say that a 2-year product tastes the same as a 4-year product. Like it's 2 different flavors.
So what you're telling me is size doesn't matter, it's how you use it.
I've always said that. Yep, obviously. Absolutely is. So yeah, I mean, you get a really like unique brand of oakiness that's awesome coming out of these 30s. And then in the 53s, you're just gonna, I think the fruitiness component plays up a little bit more because you are getting like more oak with that smaller barrel. And that's why we really try to keep it below 2.5 years, because it becomes too much of a good thing, at least for us.
Right.
Like with our recipes and how we're doing things, once it crosses into that 3-year threshold in a smaller barrel, it gets pretty dry.
Right.
And it starts to get a little tannic.
Okay.
So it's too much of a good thing,
right.
essentially.
I hear that, I mean, if it gets to that point, you literally have to let it age significantly longer to get out of that.
To break down.
Yeah, to get out of that, and then you're hanging on to product for a long time. So.
Exactly. So.
Well, thank you, Ryan. This has been very informative, and obviously we love what you guys are doing here. And if you haven't had a chance to see, we've got some googly eyes that Ryan has adorned the barrels with. So
it wasn't just me. It was Megan Brown as well. Gonna throw you under the bus. But you know, April Fool's comes around and you gotta put googly eyes on things every now and then. So it's fine.
Ryan, thanks for your time, man.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.